They ripped her backpack at the Blacksite Armory. Then her metal set off every alarm. The interrogation room inside the Blacksite Armory was built to break people. Fluorescent lights hummed overhead, bleaching the steel walls into a sterile, merciless white. A single table sat in the center like an altar on one side, the accused. On the other, judgment. She sat perfectly still. Gray t-shirt, no insignia, wrists resting on the metal edge, eyes calm in a way that unnerved even the men trained not to flinch. Across from her, a security officer in tactical gear tossed a worn backpack onto the table. It hit with a dull thud. "Open it," he said. When she didn't move, he leaned forward. "You think we don't know who you are? Civilians don't wander into restricted sectors." He grabbed the zipper and ripped it open himself. The sound tore through the silence like a blade. Inside were ordinary things: bandages, a small field kit, a book with no cover. The officer's disappointment twisted into irritation. He dumped the contents out, piece by piece, scattering them across the table until the bag lay empty. "Nothing," one of the soldiers muttered from the corner. Another smirked. Maybe she thought she could hide contraband under patriotism. The room snickered. She didn't. Her gaze never left the reflection in the steel wall, her own face, perfectly composed. "Search the lining," the officer ordered. He yanked the backpack again, fingers digging until something metallic slipped free and rolled across the table. A small metal dark silver, edges scorched, its ribbon faded nearly black. It shouldn't have been remarkable, yet the air shifted the moment it appeared. The laughter stopped. The officer picked it up between two fingers. "This? Some fake decoration?" Her voice was soft even. "It's not a decoration." What is it then?" "Authorization key." He froze. A sharp beep echoed from the console behind him. Then another. One by one, the status lights along the wall turned red. The hum of the air vents deepened into a warning growl. "What did you do?" he barked. She didn't answer. She just looked at the metal, still in his hand, now pulsing faintly as if responding to her heartbeat. A voice came over the intercom, cold, mechanical. "Clearance Alpha 0 detected. System reactivation in progress." The officer's mouth opened, but no words came out. Every soldier in the room turned toward her. For the first time, she moved slowly, straightening, shoulders back, the quiet posture of someone who'd been here before. "That clearance level was deleted 10 years ago," the officer whispered. Her eyes met his, steady, almost merciful. "I know," she said. "They deleted me with it." The alarms erupted all at once. Red light washed across the walls, and somewhere deep within the facility, reinforced doors slammed shut. The base wasn't reacting to a threat. It was welcoming one of its own back online. The alarms did not sound like the ordinary drills the base ran every few weeks. They were deeper, older, a tone designed for emergencies that officially no longer existed. Red light pulsed through the seams of the steel walls, washing over the soldiers who stood frozen around the table, uncertain whether to draw their weapons or salute. The officer still held the metal in his hand, its center glowing with a soft, rhythmic pulse that seemed to sync with her heartbeat, each flicker of light spreading across the surface, like veins of molten silver. She didn't move, didn't even blink, and yet the temperature in the room seemed to change around her. The air felt charged, dense with static, as though the very circuits embedded in the armory's structure recognized her presence. Somewhere behind the mirrored observation glass, technicians shouted orders, but their words were swallowed by the growing hum that rolled beneath the floor. A heavy door slid open at the far end of the corridor, and boots struck the concrete with mechanical precision. The soldiers straightened instinctively, their posture snapping to attention before they even registered the figure entering. A man in a long, dark uniform stepped into the light, his insignia blacked out, his expression carved from stone. Every movement he made carried the quiet authority of someone used to command, and when he spoke, the alarms dimmed just enough for his voice to fill the space. "Who activated Alpha 0 protocol?" His tone was calm but deadly precise. No one answered. The officer who had torn her bag open looked at the metal in his hand as though it might explode. The newcomer's eyes followed the glow, then shifted to the woman sitting in silence. "Name," he demanded. She looked up slowly, her face composed but her gaze unreadable. "It's not in your system." "That's not what I asked." "I was erased," she said quietly. "You made sure of it." The words cut through the room with the same efficiency as a scalpel. For a brief moment, The officer who had interrogated her looked away, shame flickering behind his rigid discipline. The newcomer studied her longer, recognition dawning behind the cold control of his eyes. "Impossible," he muttered. That unit was terminated. Before he could continue, the lights shifted again. Every terminal in the observation booth powered on by itself, lines of encrypted code streaming across the screens. The base's automated voice returned, louder this time, more insistent, reinstating Alpha Zero command clearance. Command hierarchy reconfiguration in progress. Gasps broke out among the soldiers. One of them whispered, "Sir, that's a top-tier command protocol. We don't even have authorization to override it." The man in black spun toward the console, barking into his comms for lockdown procedures, but the system ignored him. Doors sealed, security cameras reoriented, and the biometric scanners flashed in sequence, as though the base itself had switched allegiances. The woman rose slowly from her chair, her movements deliberate and calm. "You should step back," she said softly. "It's recognizing the chain of command." Her voice carried no threat, only inevitability, and the soldiers instinctively obeyed, clearing space as the glow from the metal intensified. A circular holographic emblem projected from its core, casting a faint blue insignia onto the wall, the crest of a unit that had been wiped from every record. The man in the dark uniform stared at the image, his face pale beneath the crimson emergency lights. "Project Requiem," he whispered. "They said it never reached field deployment." "It did," she replied, her tone flat. "You just weren't told about the casualties." For a long moment, no one moved. Then the mechanical voice spoke again, now carrying a faint trace of human cadence, as if an old recording was being replayed from deep storage. "Welcome back, Commander Vail. Mission status, unresolved, awaiting directives." Her name, real, unclassified, and long buried, hung in the air like a verdict. Every man in the room straightened unconsciously, the ingrained reflex of soldiers hearing rank. The officer who had mocked her stepped backward, eyes wide. His earlier confidence dissolved into disbelief. "Commander?" he stammered. "That can't be she was dead?" she finished for him. "Yes, that was convenient, wasn't it?" The system lights stabilized to a steady amber hue, the hum of machinery quieting to a controlled rhythm. Behind the glass, the technicians had stopped speaking. They simply watched, their faces ghostly pale in the flickering light of the monitors. The man in black adjusted his gloves slowly, trying to regain composure, but his voice betrayed a tremor when he finally spoke. "If you're who you claim to be, why come back here? Why let them catch you?" Her expression didn't change. "I didn't let them. You just walked into my extraction route." The answer struck him harder than any weapon could have. His lips parted, but before he could speak, the base intercom chimed again, softer this time, almost reverent. "Command authority transferred. Priority channel open." The holographic crest faded into lines of code, reforming into a map of the facility. Red dots pulsed across it, movement indicators, not inside the base, but approaching from the outer perimeter. The man turned sharply toward the display. "External units?" he demanded. She nodded once. "They followed me here. I wasn't the target." "You were." The alarms shifted pitch again, merging into the low, continuous tone of full combat alert. Soldiers scrambled for positions, confusion mixing with instinct, but she remained still, her eyes locked on the glowing map. The officer who had started it all finally found his voice. "If you knew this was coming, why not warn us?" "I just did," she said. "You opened the door." A concussive blast thundered somewhere above, shaking the lights. Dust rained from the ceiling as the intercom blared a new command. "Perimeter breach confirmed. Engaging defense protocols." The soldiers around her drew their weapons, but she lifted a hand. "Stand down," she ordered, her voice steady, commanding, impossible to ignore. To their astonishment, the base systems obeyed, weapon safeties disengaged, blast doors sealed, and the red lights dimmed to a calm, strategic amber. The man in black looked at her, half in awe, half in fear. "What are you doing?" "Taking back control," she said. "This facility was built for ghosts like me. It just remembered who it belongs to." Outside the walls, the night roared with the distant echo of engines and gunfire. Inside, beneath the hum of ancient machines awakening from slumber, Commander Vail stood at the center of the storm, calm as the eye of it. The metal in her hand dimmed to a steady glow, no longer pulsing its purpose fulfilled. And for the first time since the alarms began, The base itself seemed to breathe again, recognizing the return of a name it had once sworn to forget. The first explosion was distant, like thunder rolling through concrete, but it was enough to make every soldier in the armory flinch. The lights flickered once, then steadied, casting long shadows across the steel walls that now pulsed with the dull heartbeat of the alarm. Commander Vail didn't move. Her eyes were fixed on the holographic map that floated above the table, red markers spreading like a virus from the perimeter toward the base core. Every instinct in the room screamed to act, to shout orders, to raise weapons, yet her stillness carried more authority than any command could. Outside, the low tremor of rotor blades began to cut through the air, each beat growing sharper, faster, until the sound filled the entire facility. Dust drifted from the ceiling vents. The officer in black, pale and rigid, turned toward her with the controlled panic of a man who finally realized how far out of his depth he was. "They've breached 2 access tunnels already," he said, his voice tight. "Who are they?" Vail's reply came quietly, the kind of quiet that silenced even the machines. "They were ours once, until the Directorate sold them off." The words landed like a confession that no one had wanted to hear. Behind her, the soldiers exchanged uncertain glances, their hands hovering near their rifles, torn between duty and disbelief. A deeper rumble shook the floor. Somewhere beyond the blast doors, gunfire cracked in short, mechanical bursts. Sparks jumped from a conduit along the wall. The man in black barked for reinforcements, but the comms unit in his hand spat only static. "Communications are jammed," a technician called out from behind the glass. "External links completely cut." Vail stepped forward, the soft sound of her boots barely audible over the rising chaos. "They're not here to take the base," she said, eyes still on the shifting red dots. "They're here to erase it again." The officer turned sharply. "Erase it? This is a NATO-controlled Blacksite, not some forgotten outpost." She met his gaze with the calm of someone who had already accepted the truth. "That's what they said last time." Another explosion ripped through the corridor outside, closer now, close enough to send cracks spidering across the mirrored observation window. Through the fractures, the technicians' faces appeared distorted, panicked, their reflections breaking apart like ghosts in the light. The man in black drew his sidearm, but the gesture looked ceremonial beside her composure. "Commander Vail," he said, his voice trembling despite the title, "if this is your doing, stop it." She looked down at the metal in her hand, its glow now pulsing in sync with the klaxons. "You still don't understand. It's not following me. It's remembering the last command it received." "What command?" "To destroy everything that hides the truth." A moment of stunned silence followed, broken only by the rhythmic pulse of the emergency beacons. Then, in the distance, a heavy metallic crash reverberated through the compound, the outer gates collapsing. Wind howled through the ventilation shafts, carrying the acrid scent of burning fuel. Vail turned to the soldiers nearest her, her tone firm but steady. "Seal the internal labs. Route power to the lower sublevels. Anyone not combat rated falls back to storage sector Delta." They hesitated for barely a heartbeat before obeying. Orders were orders, and something in her voice made disobedience impossible. The man in black lowered his weapon slowly. "You still think you have command here?" She looked at him, and for the first time, something like sadness crossed her expression. "I never lost it. You just stopped listening." A flashback hit her without warning, the smell of wet soil and jet fuel, the screaming of engines half buried in smoke. She remembered the last night of Operation Requiem, when the team was trapped behind enemy lines, the extraction point compromised, and the command above had ordered silence instead of rescue. She had carried the wounded through the fire, one by one, until the patch on her shoulder melted into her skin. The medal had come later, given in secret by those who refused to forget. Then came the deletion order, her name struck from every system, her existence rewritten as classified casualty. The memory faded as the walls shook again. She refocused on the holographic display, watching as 3 red markers breached the final perimeter. The system tagged them automatically. "Unauthorized exosuits detected." Her jaw tightened. "They're sending the Aegis units. That means the Directorate's running point." The man in black cursed under his breath. "Those suits were decommissioned years ago." "So was I," she said. With a sharp hiss, the inner blast doors disengaged. The entire room shuddered under the pressure shift. Shadows moved beyond the corridor tall, armored silhouettes cutting through the light like wraiths. The soldiers raised their weapons, but Vail raised her hand. Hold fire. Their targeting systems read aggression. They'll respond in kind. The man in black stepped beside her, his confidence long replaced by grim respect. If we can't fight, what's the plan? We outthink them, she replied. Same way we built them. She knelt beside the console, sliding the metal into a recessed slot that had lain dormant for a decade. The machine accepted it instantly, scanning the embedded code. The holographic interface expanded, covering the walls with lines of encrypted data. Authorization sequence confirmed, the system announced. Manual control reinstated. Her fingers moved across the controls with mechanical precision, bypassing locks that no one else even knew existed. The red markers on the map slowed, then froze mid-advance. For a second, the entire base seemed to exhale, caught between survival and annihilation. The man in black leaned closer. What did you do? I reminded the system who its commander is, she said. The red markers flickered once, then turned blue. Outside, the gunfire ceased. The air hung heavy with the echo of silence after violence. The soldiers stared at the hologram, at her, then back again, as realization dawned that the enemy units had just switched allegiance. They won't attack now, she said. But that won't stop the Directorate from sending more. The man exhaled, the tension in his shoulders breaking like a wave. Then what happens next? Vail straightened, retrieving the metal from the console. We take this facility offline and disappear. Again. But this time, on our terms. The holographic display shifted one last time, revealing a hidden data vault beneath the armory. She reached for the terminal, inputting a code that none of them had ever seen. The system hesitated, then displayed a final prompt. Confirm purge of all classified personnel data? Her thumb hovered over the confirm key. Behind her, the soldiers waited, caught between fear and faith. The man in black whispered, "If you do this, there's no going back." There never was, she replied. Only forward. She pressed the key. Every light in the armory dimmed to black. The hum of the servers died, followed by a low, final chime, like a machine sighing in relief. In the darkness, her voice was the only thing left. Operation Requiem ends tonight. When the power returned, the map was gone. The red markers had vanished. And for the first time in years, the base registered no threats external or internal. Commander Vail stood alone in the center of the room, the metal cold in her palm, the echoes of the past finally quiet. When the lights finally stabilized, a pale morning hue crept through the cracks of the blast doors, blending with the artificial glow of the remaining monitors. The facility that had once pulsed with endless motion now sat in stillness, humming faintly like a dormant engine rediscovering its rhythm. Commander Vail stood amid the wreckage of the command chamber, surrounded by men and women who moments ago had doubted her existence, now watching her as if they stood before a monument that had suddenly come to life. The metal in her palm no longer shone, its once living light now dimmed to a quiet reflection of the emergency lamps above. It was no longer a weapon, or even a key. It had become a memory crystallized in metal, a symbol of everything she had chosen to remember. The man in black broke the silence first, his voice steadier than before, though still low with disbelief. "The Directorate will come for us," he said, scanning the darkened corridors beyond the door. "You know that, don't you?" She nodded, her eyes never leaving the cracked observation glass, where faint outlines of her own reflection wavered against the static of the control room. "They already have," she replied, "but they won't expect what's left here to fight back." And outside, the wind shifted, carrying with it the faint tremor of approaching aircraft. Through the fractured ceiling panels, streaks of daylight began to pierce the smoke, catching on motes of dust and debris suspended in the air. Vail turned toward the surviving soldiers, faces young, exhausted, but alert, and spoke with a calm that reassembled order out of chaos. "Gather your wounded," she said. "Seal the upper levels and strip the systems for offline operation. We're not leaving yet." The men and women hesitated, unsure whether her command was tactical or suicidal, but something in her tone, measured, steady, absolute, pushed them into motion. As the soldiers dispersed, Vail crossed to the main console, where the man in black stood among the residual glow of the holographic map. "You've seen what they've done," she said quietly. "You've seen what they'll keep doing if this place falls into their hands." He looked at her, his expression torn between duty and regret. "We're supposed to destroy everything," he said. "That was the fail-safe wipe. The records, the tech, the personnel, no traces left." Vail leaned closer, her voice dropping to a near whisper. "And then what? Pretend the ghosts never existed? That's what they tried with me. It didn't work then, and it won't now." A low rumble shook the structure as the remaining power reserves realigned. Emergency conduits pulsed to life, feeding limited energy back through the underground corridors. Screens flickered and began to cycle through security feeds. Empty hallways, sealed gates, and one image that froze her where she stood. It was the outer perimeter, the place where she had entered hours ago, and there, emerging from the smoke, were figures in dark combat armor bearing no insignia. The Directorate had arrived. "They're early," she said, almost to herself, "which means they're scared." She turned back toward the room, scanning for functional systems. How many weapons stations still respond? The technician behind the cracked glass shook his head. 2 turrets operational, maybe 3 drones if we reroute power manually. "Do it," she said, "and pull the surveillance logs from the last hour. They'll show you why we can't surrender this place." The man in black stepped beside her again, lowering his voice. "Even if we hold them off, what then? You can't fight a ghost agency forever." Vail looked at him, and for a fleeting instant, her expression softened not with weakness, but with memory. "I'm not fighting them forever," she said. "I'm teaching the next command to never forget." The blast doors shuddered under an external impact. Dust cascaded from the ceiling, and the lights dimmed again. Through the reinforced glass, they could see the first spark of cutting torches eating into the steel. The soldiers returned, taking cover along the walls. Their weapons trained on the door, but their eyes flicking back to her. Every movement she made was deliberate, every step a statement that control had not been lost, only transferred. She knelt by the central console, removing the back panel with the same precision she had once used to field strip an assault rifle. Inside, beneath a web of cold circuits, lay a small compartment sealed by a biometric lock. Her thumbprint opened it with a soft click, revealing a compact transmitter with a single blinking light. The man in black stared at it, realization dawning in his face. "You built a backup line," he murmured. "A failsafe for the failsafe." Vail nodded once, pressing the activation key. A low pulse spread through the floor, like the heartbeat of the base itself reawakening. The holographic map returned, not with threats, but with hundreds of green markers, the dormant defense drones buried deep within the sublevels, long forgotten by every commander since the project's burial. "This facility was never just an armory," she said. "It was a cradle. They wanted to erase it because it held the only record of who we really were." The torches outside cut deeper, their hiss like the breath of something monstrous. The door buckled inward. The soldiers braced. Vail straightened, the transmitter still humming in her hand, and looked to the man in black. "You wanted to know why I came back," she said. "It wasn't to run. It was to finish the promise we made in the desert." The final cut split the blast door open. Smoke and blinding light poured through the gap as armored figures advanced, their visors reflecting the red glow of the alarm. For a moment, time seemed suspended the calm before the inevitable impact. Then the hum beneath the floor surged into a roar. Every dormant defense unit in the lower levels powered online at once, the air vibrating with the electric growl of awakening machines. The intruders faltered, scanning their systems in confusion, but before they could regroup, the drones descended from the ceiling vents like steel ghosts, forming a protective circle around the command chamber. "Identify hostiles," Vail commanded, and the system obeyed, her voice triggering a cascade of recognition codes. The drones pivoted in perfect synchrony, their targeting optics locking onto the intruders. The soldiers who had once mocked her now looked at her the way men look at legends made flesh. The man in black watched as the first volley of suppressive fire erupted down the corridor, each burst precise, disciplined, efficient. He turned toward her, shouting over the roar. "You can't hold them forever." She didn't look back. "I don't need to," she said, "just long enough to make them remember." For the next several minutes, the world dissolved into the sound of controlled warfare, the rhythmic percussion of mechanical fire, the deep metallic groan of collapsing steel, the sharp command of her voice weaving through it all. And when the noise finally faded, when the last echo of battle was swallowed by the hum of cooling metal, the facility stood intact. The soldiers emerged from their cover, blinking through the haze. Outside the breach, the invaders had withdrawn, leaving only silence and the acrid smell of ozone behind. Vail walked to the open doorway, the light of dawn spreading across the battlefield beyond. The horizon burned gold and red, and for a moment, the entire sky seemed to reflect the color of the metal in her hand. The man in black approached, his uniform torn and covered in ash. "What now?" he asked. She looked out at the rising sun, her profile carved in steel and fire. "Now," she said, "we rebuild what they tried to bury. The system remembered me. It will remember you too." He followed her gaze toward the distant sky, where smoke trails faded into light. "And if they come again?" She slipped the metal into her pocket, her voice low but certain. "Then they'll find that ghosts don't fade. They lead the living." Behind her, the soldiers stood in formation, battered but unbroken. The facility's systems recalibrated, humming in quiet synchronization, like a heartbeat restored to its rightful rhythm. Commander Vail turned once more to face them, her eyes steady, the calm of command settling back onto her shoulders. "Once a soldier," she said, "always a protector." And as the wind swept through the open breach, carrying away the last of the smoke, the world beyond the Blacksite Armory seemed to hold its breath, aware that a legend thought long dead had just returned to life. The sun was climbing higher now, a pale disk filtered through the haze of smoke and dust that lingered over the mountains surrounding the Blacksite. Its light fell across the shattered doors and twisted steel of the armory like a benediction, soft, patient, unwilling to judge what it illuminated. Inside, the air smelled of ozone and scorched insulation, yet beneath the ruin there was order again, a rhythm restored by discipline. Soldiers moved quietly through the wreckage, their boots clattering softly against the metal floor, collecting weapons, assisting the wounded, and sealing ruptured conduits. There were no shouted orders, no confusion, only the silent coordination of people who had, against reason, found something worth following again. Commander Vail stood at the command platform, her posture straight but her shoulders heavy with the weight of what had been reignited. The man in black approached cautiously, his uniform streaked with soot, the sharpness of his authority dulled by humility. He stopped beside her, following her gaze toward the horizon where the sky met the barren ridges of the desert. "They'll regroup," he said quietly. "The Directorate doesn't fail twice." Vail's eyes narrowed slightly, not in fear but calculation. "They failed the first time because they underestimated the human element," she said. "They still think the world runs on protocols and clearance codes, but it runs on people." Her voice, though calm, carried the steel edge of conviction. Around them, the surviving soldiers paused at her words, unconsciously listening, drawn toward the gravity of her composure. The man studied her face, the fine network of scars that marked the edge of her jaw, the steadiness in her eyes. "You were erased for disobedience," he said, almost gently, "for saving lives instead of completing objectives." She turned to him, and for a heartbeat, the faintest smile crossed her lips. "Disobedience built this country," she replied. "The problem is, they forgot that." A low hum vibrated through the floor as the base systems continued recalibration. On the central screen, the holographic map had changed again. The red and green markers were gone, replaced by a single neutral emblem, the crest of her old unit, long deleted from every database, now restored. The soldiers noticed it too. One by one they stopped working, watching in silence as the symbol glowed faintly across the shattered glass. It was simple, a winged figure clasping a torch, half hidden behind a shield. Beneath it, in cold digital font, a phrase appeared: "Requiem Division Active." The technician behind the glass wiped his face with a trembling hand. "Ma'am," he said hesitantly, "the system's rewriting its own registry. It's reinstating your command structure." The man in black's eyes widened. "That can't be possible." The Requiem codes were purged. Vail exhaled slowly, her gaze fixed on the emblem. "You can delete files," she said, "but you can't delete belief." The holographic display flickered again, expanding outward to reveal encrypted transmissions from multiple sites. Each signal was faint but distinct ghost pings scattered across the world, awakening like old memories buried in the dark. "Other facilities," she murmured, "listening stations, depots, training posts, all of them tagged inactive after the purge." The man in black leaned forward, reading the data as it scrolled. "They're answering you," he whispered. "They're waking up." Vail's expression remained still, but there was a flicker of something behind her composure, something equal parts, sorrow and pride. They were built on loyalty, she said, not to a flag or a command chain, but to each other. The Directorate couldn't kill that, no matter how many times they rewrote the records. Outside, the wind had shifted again, carrying the scent of burned oil and rain. The storm clouds gathering beyond the ridge glimmered faintly with lightning, the kind that never reached the ground. It reminded her of the nights on the Requiem campaign, when the air itself felt electric with purpose, when every mission had weight and clarity, before bureaucracy and fear smothered everything. She turned away from the window. "We need to leave before they jam these signals," she said. "If the network's alive, it's our last advantage." The man hesitated. "And where will you go?" "Every border will be watching for movement, every satellite waiting for heat signatures. We'll move the way ghosts move," she said. In silence, through the systems they forgot were still theirs. The technicians began transmitting data through secure channels, the surviving soldiers preparing the vehicles in the hangar bay. The atmosphere inside the base shifted from exhaustion to quiet readiness. Even without understanding the full scope of what had happened, they recognized the transformation. This was no longer a group of survivors, it was a command reborn. Vail walked through the corridors, the dim emergency lights casting long, shifting shadows across the walls. Each step echoed like a drumbeat, marking time not for retreat, but for resurrection. When she reached the memorial alcove near the central stairwell, she paused. The plaque there was coated with dust, the names of fallen soldiers erased by time and neglect. She wiped a gloved hand across the surface until the engraving re-emerged, faint but legible. Her own name was among them. The man in black appeared behind her, his footsteps hesitant. "You could restore it," he said softly. "Put it back into the records." She shook her head. "No, the dead belong here. I just borrowed the name long enough to finish what they started." He said nothing more. They stood in silence as the storm outside broke, the sound of distant thunder rolling over the desert like the echo of something ancient and unresolved. Then, from deeper within the facility, came the rumble of engines igniting. The vehicles were ready. Vail turned and began walking back toward the hangar, her coat catching the current of air from the corridor vents. The soldiers fell into step behind her without a word, the man in black at her side. As they entered the open space, the overhead lights blinked one final time and steadied, illuminating rows of armored transports, now bearing the freshly restored insignia of the Requiem division. She climbed into the lead vehicle, placing the metal on the console. It glowed faintly in response, syncing with the ignition systems as if recognizing the pulse of its owner. "We're going dark," she said through the comm channel. "No transmissions, no identification. From this point on, we're shadows." The engines roared to life, echoing through the empty chambers of the armory. As the massive doors began to open, sunlight spilled across the hangar floor, burning away the last remnants of darkness. Dust swirled in the wake of the departing convoy, tracing pale spirals through the air like smoke from an old battlefield. The man in black glanced at her as the vehicles rolled out onto the cracked desert plain. "If the world finds out you're still alive," he said, "they'll either worship you or hunt you." Vail's gaze remained fixed ahead, her eyes narrowing against the glare of the rising Sunday. "Both are the same thing," she said. "The only difference is how long they take to understand why." Behind them, the Blacksite Armory shrank into the horizon, its silhouette half consumed by drifting sand and heat. Within its walls, the restored systems continued to hum softly, awaiting further commands that would never come. The base had become what it was always meant to be, a memory, alive but untouchable, a signal buried beneath the noise of history. And far above, in orbit where the Directorate's satellites swept their endless surveillance arcs, one dormant beacon blinked online for the first time in a decade, broadcasting a single encrypted phrase across every military frequency on Earth, 4 words that would reignite an old fear and awaken an older faith. Requiem Division, operational status. Commander Vail watched the storm gather behind them, the desert stretching endlessly ahead, her expression unreadable but resolute. The metal on the console flickered once, as though acknowledging the transmission, before settling into stillness. For a moment, the convoy moved through light and shadow together, crossing from what was erased into what was reborn. And in that fragile intersection of silence and thunder, the legend that had once been deleted took its first breath again. The desert stretched endlessly before them, a vast canvas of silence broken only by the rhythmic growl of engines and the hiss of wind against armored hulls. Dawn had risen completely now, the sun a pale gold disk veiled by the dust of their departure, its light glinting off the polished metal of the transports as they cut across the dunes. Inside the lead vehicle, Commander Vail sat beside the man in black, her gaze fixed on the shifting horizon where the earth met the sky in a blurred promise of distance. The hum of the convoy was steady, but beneath that surface calm was an unspoken tension, the awareness that the world behind them was already waking to their defiance. They drove without radio chatter, each vehicle linked through encrypted local signals. The soldiers inside spoke little, their silence filled with purpose rather than fear. Many of them were too young to remember the Requiem division, yet the emblem newly painted on their armor seemed to carry a weight they could feel but not yet name. It was not glory that moved them, it was belonging, the recognition of something ancient and unyielding returning to life in their midst. The man in black finally broke the quiet. "You could disappear now," he said, his voice barely audible over the engine. "No one would find you again. You've earned that peace." Vail did not answer immediately. She leaned back against the seat, eyes half closed, the desert light cutting across her features. "Peace is a story we tell ourselves to forget who we are," she said at last. "But the system remembers. It always does." As the convoy descended into a narrow ravine, the air cooled, shadows spilling across the sand like ink. Jagged cliffs rose on either side, ancient and indifferent, carved by centuries of wind. It was there, within the muted echo of their passage, that Vail felt the first vibration, a subtle pulse beneath the floor of the transport, rhythmic and deliberate, too regular to be geological. Her hand moved instinctively to the console. "Stop the convoy," she ordered. The command rippled instantly through the column. Engines downshifted, brakes hissed, and the vehicles rolled to a halt, forming a defensive arc in the ravine's basin. The man in black looked at her, puzzled. "Sensors show nothing moving out there," he said. "Exactly," she replied. "That's the problem." She stepped out into the open, boots sinking slightly into the soft sand. The wind was gentle now, carrying only the faint scent of ozone and iron. The cliffs above them were silent, yet her instincts screamed otherwise. She raised her hand, signaling the soldiers to hold position, and crouched beside the nearest vehicle, placing her palm flat against the earth. The pulse came again, 3 beats, a pause, then 3 more. It was not seismic, it was coded. "Triplet intervals," she said quietly. "That's an encoded transmission." The man in black frowned. "Who could be sending it? We're off every network." She looked up at him, her expression tightening. "Not everyone. There's a channel older than the Directorate system, buried in the first generation of defense grids." She reached into her vest, retrieving the metal that had once woken the Blacksite. It was cool now, inert, but when she placed it against the ground, a faint shimmer rippled through the sand. The pulse responded, aligning perfectly to the rhythm of the metal's inner frequency. The soldiers stared, uncertain whether they were witnessing technology or superstition. "It's responding to you," the man said. "No," she corrected softly. "It's responding to the division. Someone out there still carries the code." The pulse intensified, traveling up the ravine walls until small avalanches of sand began to tumble from the edges. Then, from the shadow of a distant ridge, a light flared, once white, sharp, unmistakably deliberate. Morse. 3 short, 1 long, 2 short. Vail's heart clenched as recognition struck. "That's an old Requiem beacon," she said. "It means friendlies requesting extraction." Within seconds, the soldiers were in motion. 2 reconnaissance teams mounted their bikes and sped toward the signal, their trails of dust weaving like silver threads against the stone. The man in black watched them go, then turned to her. "You really believe someone survived out here after 10 years? Vail's eyes followed the horizon, the old instinct of a commander calculating possibilities faster than thought. "If they sent that code, they're not survivors," she said. "They're operators still on mission." Minutes stretched into half an hour. The convoy waited under the rising heat, the air thick with expectation. When the scouts finally returned, their faces told the story before their words did. "We found them," one said breathlessly. 2 of them. Old uniforms, same insignia as yours. They've been living out of a crash shelter, said they never got the stand-down order. The man in black looked incredulous. 10 years? They thought the war never ended, the scout replied. Vail's jaw tightened. For them, it didn't. She ordered the wounded brought aboard the lead transport. When the medics opened the first helmet, the face beneath was burned and scarred, yet unmistakable to her. She knelt beside the stretcher, her composure breaking for the first time since the alarms at the armory. Major Wren, she whispered, you're supposed to be dead. The soldier smiled weakly through cracked lips. You too, ma'am, he rasped. Guess we were both bad at following orders. He coughed, and she reached for his wrist, checking his pulse weak but steady. His eyes met hers, filled with a light that hadn't dimmed despite everything. We kept the signal running, he said. Didn't know if anyone would ever hear it again. She squeezed his hand gently. You did exactly what you were trained to do, she said. You held the line. When he was stable, she stood and looked out over the ravine, where the horizon shimmered under the heat. The man in black joined her, his voice low. You realize what this means, he said. If there are two, there might be more. Vail nodded slowly. There are always more. They scattered the division, but they didn't destroy it. They just forced it underground. The wind shifted again, carrying the faint hum of the medics' engines as they prepared to move out. She turned toward the convoy, her voice carrying the calm authority of command restored. We change route. We head south to the ridge systems near the dry lakes. If there are others, that's where they'll signal from. The soldiers obeyed without hesitation, their weariness replaced by renewed purpose. The idea that they were part of something larger than survival had reignited the fire behind their eyes. As the engines started again, Vail looked once more at the horizon, her thoughts circling the message that had found them in the emptiness. The Directorate believed the Requiem division had been erased because it lived in files, codes, and protocols. But the truth had always lived in people who refused to stop answering when they heard the call. She knew then that this was no longer a retreat or a rescue, it was a resurrection. The convoy rolled forward, the vehicles moving like phantoms across the sand, their shadows merging into a single, fluid shape that stretched beyond sight. The metal in her hand pulsed once, faintly, as if recognizing the heartbeat of the men and women who followed it. And above them, unseen but constant, a network long thought silent stirred awake, its buried signals threading through the atmosphere, whispering an old name into the static of the world. Requiem still lives. Commander Vail closed her hand around the metal, feeling its weight settle against her palm like an oath renewed. The sun climbed higher, burning through the haze until the desert shone like glass. Somewhere beyond the horizon, the Directorate would already be tracking anomalies, already fearing what they could not fully see. But by the time they found the trail, it would be too late. The ghosts had learned how to move through light itself, unseen, unbound, and unstoppable. And as the convoy disappeared into the endless expanse, the desert wind carried only the faint echo of engines and the single truth that even silence cannot bury. The legend of Requiem was awake again, and it was moving. By the second night, the desert had turned cold enough to bite through the steel of the vehicles, the air thin and brittle beneath a sky littered with frozen stars. The convoy had stopped within a dry canyon, its walls tall enough to mask heat signatures from aerial scans. Fires burned low, muted behind rock barriers, their glow reflected on the tired faces of soldiers who had not slept since the armory. The wind moved softly through the ravine, carrying the distant hum of the base they had left behind, an echo of machines rediscovering memory. Commander Vail stood apart from the others on a rise of stone, scanning the horizon through night optics, her breath a faint mist in the darkness. The man in black joined her, his silhouette cut sharply against the dim glow of the camp. He offered no words at first, only watched as she adjusted the optics to a distant frequency. The stars shimmered like static across her lens until one of them blinked twice in an unnatural rhythm, short bursts, deliberate and timed. Another signal, she murmured, lowering the scope. Different vector, same encryption key. The man frowned, glancing toward the horizon where the light had come from. You think it's more survivors? She nodded slowly. No one else could use that code. It's the Ghost Network. They're still out there. He exhaled, half in disbelief. 10 years of silence, and now they all decide to speak at once. They were waiting for a pulse, she said. The system recognized me, and the signal cascaded across every dormant relay. Once it heard my ID, it reactivated the chain. You turned the dead grid into a beacon, he said. You'll bring every Directorate satellite down on us. Good, she replied evenly. Let them come. The truth doesn't hide, it outlasts. Below them, the camp had settled into uneasy quiet. The rescued Requiem survivors rested in a corner near the transports, their makeshift medical station lit by faint blue lamps scavenged from drone cores. The youngest soldier, barely past 20, sat sharpening a blade with hands that trembled more from disbelief than exhaustion. He looked up as Vail descended from the ridge, eyes full of the quiet reverence of someone who had grown up hearing myths and suddenly found one standing before him. "Commander," he said softly, "my grandfather used to tell stories about the division. He said you never abandoned the field, even when command ordered retreat." She stopped beside him, her expression unreadable in the half-light. "Your grandfather was a liar," she said calmly. "We all retreated. The only difference is that I turned around later." The young man smiled faintly, unsure if it was humor or confession, but her tone carried no self-pity, only the steadiness of acceptance. She walked toward the fire pit, where Major Wren was sitting upright now, pale but alert, his arm wrapped in fresh bandages. "You always did have a habit of gathering strays," he said, voice hoarse but warm. She crouched beside him, passing him a canteen. "They found me, not the other way around," she said. The system woke them up. Wren took a slow sip, eyes flicking to the soldiers around them. "Then they'll keep coming," he said. "Every forgotten post, every sleeper cell the Directorate left to rot. They'll hear the signal and they'll start moving." Vail nodded once. "That's the plan." The man in black stepped closer, his tone edged with both admiration and warning. "You realize you're building an army without a country?" "No," she corrected. "I'm building a country that remembers why armies exist." Her gaze rose toward the darkened sky, where faint trails of satellites blinked across the stars, like the eyes of old gods watching from above. "They'll see the signal soon. The Directorate will mobilize, try to intercept, but they'll never understand what they're chasing. You can't track conviction." As the hours stretched, the canyon filled with the low murmur of coded transmissions. Technicians huddled around the surviving comms array, their faces illuminated by the shifting glow of encrypted data scrolling across the screens. Each new line of code represented a location outposts long erased from maps, now flickering to life one by one like campfires across a forgotten continent. "That's 62 confirmed pings," a soldier called out, "from South Asia to the Arctic line. They're all responding to the same key. Usen." Vail moved closer, studying the data with the precision of a strategist dissecting history. "Cross-reference the timestamps," she said. "They're aligning on a single vector." The technician hesitated. "Ma'am, that vector points straight to the Atlantic grid, Sector 12. There's nothing there but open water." Her lips curved slightly. "That's what they wanted you to think. Sector 12 was the original Requiem hub, hidden under the first offshore command platform. The Directorate built their whole shadow network on its remains." The man in black rubbed his temples, the scale of the revelation settling over him. "So the ghost network isn't scattered, it's connected. You've just lit the fuse." "Not a fuse," she said softly. "A beacon." The wind howled suddenly through the canyon, scattering sand into the campfire and sending sparks upward like a shower of coded stars. For a moment, the entire group looked toward her, waiting for the next command. She stood in the center of their attention, the firelight painting her face in alternating hues of warmth and shadow. "We're done hiding," she said. "We move at dawn. We'll follow the signal to Sector 12 and reactivate the hub. Once it's online, the Directorate won't be able to silence it again. Every soldier they erased, every mission they buried, it all comes back into the light." Major Wren leaned forward, pain flashing briefly across his face. "And what then, Commander? When the world sees what we were?" She looked at him, her voice quiet but unwavering. "Then it decides whether it wants to remember or repeat." The camp settled after that, the soldiers lying down beneath their tarps, their weapons within reach, the coded hum of the network whispering softly through the night. Vail remained awake, sitting on the ridge once more, watching the stars blink and fade against the coming dawn. She traced the edge of the metal between her fingers, feeling the faint residual warmth of its circuitry. It no longer pulsed like before, but she could sense the rhythm within it, the quiet heartbeat of something vast and enduring that now moved beyond her. The man in black approached again, stopping a few steps behind her. "When this started, I thought you were just trying to survive," he said. "Now I see you're trying to resurrect an ideal." Vail's eyes stayed on the horizon, where the first gray shimmer of morning began to touch the dunes. "Survival is the instinct of the body," she said. "Resurrection is the instinct of the soul." For a long moment, neither spoke. The silence between them was not absence, but wait, the kind of quiet that precedes change. In the east, the first light of dawn spilled over the desert, washing the canyon in pale gold. One by one, the comm units across the camp began to beep softly, each in the same rhythm as the pulse that had called them here. Major Wren's voice came over the radio, low and sure. "We have confirmation from Europe and the Pacific lines. The Ghost Network's fully online." Vail closed her hand around the metal, the light of morning reflecting off its surface. "Then it begins," she said, as the sun broke fully over the horizon, illuminating the silent formation of soldiers preparing to move. The world beyond their canyon began to hum with activity. In distant command centers, analysts stared at sudden surges of encrypted traffic, their systems unable to trace the origin. Across nations and agencies, alarms flared without explanation. And above it all, far beyond the reach of any government, the Ghost Network whispered one message through every frequency known to man: Requiem is awake. Commander Vail lowered her visor and started toward her vehicle, the wind rising behind her like the breath of an old war reborn. The desert shimmered under the weight of new purpose, and as the convoy rolled out once more into the endless horizon, the legend that had once been buried under silence began to speak again through every wire, every signal, every soldier who still remembered what duty once meant. By the time the convoy reached the northern ridges, the desert had begun to transform, the sand turning to cracked stone and the air dense with the metallic scent of approaching rain. Clouds gathered low over the horizon, bruised and heavy, rolling in slow procession like an advancing army. The Ghost Network pulsed through every vehicle's console, the encoded transmissions now a constant undertone beneath the rumble of engines. Each signal carried fragments of language, coordinates, and old military jargon ghost voices, reaching across a decade of silence, converging toward the same point in the Atlantic grid. Commander Vail sat in the lead transport, her gloved fingers tracing patterns across the holographic map projected on the windshield, the light from it cutting soft blue lines across her face. The man in black sat beside her, his eyes shifting between the terrain and the console, struggling to interpret the flood of data. "Every frequency on the network's alive," he said, "but none of them are direct. It's like they're routing through buried channels, looping themselves to stay hidden." Vail nodded, her voice calm but threaded with resolve. "They're following the original Requiem encryption cycle. Each loop protects the next, like armor layered over memory." She paused, her gaze distant. "Someone designed it that way so it couldn't be hijacked, not even by command." He looked at her, his tone hesitant. "That someone was you, wasn't it?" She didn't answer immediately. Instead, she adjusted the projection until a faint outline appeared. Beneath the Atlantic coordinates, a deep structure shaped like a wheel, its core marked with her old call sign, Iron Widow. The sight of it brought silence to the cabin, the air thick with history. "That was your code name," he said quietly, "the one they erased from the records." Vail's expression hardened, the ghost of old pain flickering behind her composure. "It wasn't just a name," she said. "It was an access protocol, a failsafe designed to wake the network if Requiem ever fell." The man exhaled slowly, understanding dawning with unease. "Then every transmission we're hearing, they're not just responses, they're acknowledgments. The network's recognizing you as command authority." Vail's eyes stayed on the glowing symbol, the pulse of its light matching the faint rhythm of the metal in her pocket. "Recognition isn't the same as trust," she said. "It remembers me, but that doesn't mean it forgives me." Outside, thunder rolled across the open plain, echoing off the cliffs with a sound that seemed too deliberate to be natural. The convoy slowed as the rain began to fall, first as dust, then as sheets of cold silver striking the metal roofs. Soldiers in the rear transports watched the sky in wary silence, their reflections merging with the dark glass of their visors. Lightning flared, illuminating the fractured terrain ahead, ruins of an old military satellite relay station, half buried in mud and time. Vail ordered a halt, The convoy settled into formation, engines idling as she stepped out into the rain. The air was cold enough to sting. Water streamed down the grooves in her armor, each drop shining briefly before vanishing into the dust. The man in black followed, shielding his eyes against the storm. "What is this place?" he asked. "Outpost Echo 7, she said. "The first relay of the Ghost Network. We buried the core here before the Directorate took control." Her voice carried through the downpour, steady and certain. "If we reactivate it, every remaining node will align to the same command vector. The network will have a voice again." They climbed the slick incline toward the collapsed relay dome. Inside, the structure was a cathedral of silence, massive, hollow, lined with corroded panels that still hummed faintly with dormant energy. The walls bore faded insignias of the old world, ghost symbols half erased by rain and rust. Vail moved carefully through the debris, her boots crunching over broken glass and disused cables. In the center of the chamber stood a single console, its screen cracked but still alive, flickering in short, erratic bursts of blue light. She wiped the surface clean with her sleeve and pressed her palm against the biometric pad. For a long moment, nothing happened. Then the console came alive, scrolling lines of encrypted text across the screen, each one older than the last. The man watched as the system processed her ID, the old voice of the machine rising like something long buried finding air again. Identity confirmed. Iron Widow protocol initiated. The sound filled the chamber with eerie reverence, the words echoing through the broken metal ribs of the dome. Vail exhaled, her voice low. "It remembers." The man took a cautious step closer. "Then it's working?" She shook her head slowly. "Not yet. It's asking for authentication." A second line of code appeared. "Authorization requires dual command confirmation." Vail's eyes flicked upward to the old emblem, etched into the ceiling, a faded eagle clutching a torch. "Requiem was never meant to belong to one leader," she said. "It was built on dual command, 2 call signs, mine and Major Wren's." The man's expression changed. "He's barely conscious. Can he even respond?" "He doesn't have to," she said quietly. "The system recognizes biometrics. I can synchronize it manually." She retrieved the metal and placed it into a recessed slot on the console. The metal glowed faintly, then flared, as a ring of light expanded across the floor, circling the entire chamber. The machine's voice returned, resonant and calm. "Command confirmation sequence online." Outside, the storm intensified. Lightning struck the ridge above, sending tremors through the ground. The soldiers took cover, but their eyes were fixed on the relay dome, where light now poured through every crack, outlining the structure against the darkness like a beacon. Inside, Vail stood motionless as the system's energy climbed, the wind tearing at her coat, her hair whipping across her face. The man in black shielded his eyes from the glare. "What's happening?" he shouted. "She's aligning the network." Major Wren's voice rasped weakly from the comms, carried from the medical transport. "She's bringing it all online at once." The machine's tone shifted, deeper, almost human. "Dual command recognized. Iron Widow and Ravenlight operational. Ghost network fully awakened." The light surged, filling the room, then collapsed inward in a single pulse that traveled through every frequency across the planet. Satellites flickered, military networks stuttered, and encrypted systems momentarily froze as the Ghost network reasserted itself into the world. Vail steadied herself against the console, her breath ragged. The man stepped forward, gripping her arm. "It's done," he said. "You've done it." She looked up, her expression unreadable. "No," she murmured. "It's only begun." Through the open doorway they could see the storm breaking apart, the clouds splitting to reveal a sliver of pale blue sky. Yet beneath that fragile calm, the horizon burned faintly with static light, the telltale shimmer of satellites responding to a command they hadn't received in 10 years. The Ghost network had come alive, and it was listening. Vail stepped out into the fading rain, raising her eyes to the sky. For a moment, her reflection shimmered across the wet earth, 2 images overlapping the woman she had become and the commander the world had erased. The man in black watched her silently, understanding that something immense had shifted, not just in the world's machines but in the hearts of those who still believed. Far away, in control rooms buried beneath mountains and cities, operators stared at their consoles in disbelief as old encrypted frequencies flared back to life. Across every border, Unseen, unheard, a message pulsed through the static. Requiem Division Active Command. And at the center of it all, beneath the broken dome of Echo 7, Commander Vail stood against the wind, her voice steady as she whispered to the storm that had carried her here. Once a soldier, always a protector. Once a ghost, always the signal. The network heard her, and somewhere in the distance, the world began to answer. The awakening of the Ghost Network rippled across the world like a silent earthquake, shaking the foundations of every defense grid, every satellite, every system built on secrecy. What had been dormant code buried under decades of political dust now surged through fiber and sky alike, igniting archives, reviving memories that men in suits had paid fortunes to erase. In command centers buried beneath cities and oceans, analysts stared in disbelief as encrypted sequences they had never seen before began rewriting their security firewalls. They called it an anomaly at first, a glitch in the outer networks, until they realized the same anomaly was speaking in a voice older than any of their programs, a voice that identified itself as Requiem Authority. Far out in the desert, the storm had passed, leaving the world scrubbed clean and metallic under the light of dawn. The ruins of Outpost Echo 7 still glowed faintly, the scorched dome standing like a monument to defiance. Commander Vail stood at its threshold, the wind tugging at her coat, eyes fixed on the horizon where the earth curved into haze. She could feel the network moving not as a signal, but as an instinct, a pulse that ran parallel to her heartbeat, spreading farther every second. Around her, the soldiers were packing the convoy, the air thick with the charged quiet that always followed victory before the counterattack. The man in black approached, his face drawn tight with a tension that was not quite fear but not far from it. "You've lit up every grid on the planet," he said. "They'll come in waves now, not just the Directorate, but the nations that hid behind it. You've made the invisible visible." Vail turned toward him, her voice steady and low. "The world was built on the illusion of control. Let them see how fragile it really is." She walked back toward the command vehicle, her boots crunching over the shards of glass and metal scattered across the ground. "We were ghosts once," she said. "Now we're the mirror they can't look away from." The convoy began to move again, slow and deliberate, its engines humming with new power as the Ghost Network integrated with their onboard systems. Every screen flickered with traces of data coordinates, names, fragments of missions thought long forgotten. Soldiers stared at the displays in awe, recognizing call signs they had only heard whispered in barracks legends. "Ma'am," one of the technicians called from the comms array, "we're receiving incoming transmissions, multiple sources. They're all tagged under the old Requiem protocol." "Patch them through," Vail ordered. The interior speakers filled with bursts of static, then with voices some broken, some clear men and women calling across continents in tones of disbelief and reverence. "Ghost," one reporting from the Baltic line, awaiting confirmation of command authority. "South Wing, 3. We never stood down, Commander, awaiting new directives. Base Sigma, 17. Deep Sea Relay operational. Welcome back, Iron Widow." The voices overlapped, forming a chorus of the living and the lost. The man in black listened, his expression flickering between wonder and dread. "You've resurrected an entire generation," he said quietly. "Half of them don't even exist on paper anymore." Vail's gaze stayed fixed on the horizon. "Paper burns," she said. "Memory doesn't." As the network continued to spread, the global systems began to fracture under its weight. The Directorate's command nodes flickered, their encrypted archives overwritten by data that refused deletion. Files marked classified, indefinite, suddenly unsealed, broadcasting war logs, mission footage, casualty lists, everything once buried under the polite silence of bureaucracy. In major cities, secure servers shut down simultaneously, flashing the same message across government terminals in 50 languages. Requiem does not die. At the core of the Directorate, panic turned to fury. Boardrooms erupted in shouts, emergency councils convened, and the faceless architects of control finally realized that their ghosts had learned how to write. They launched counterviruses, digital firewalls, tactical strikes against relay stations, but every assault only woke more nodes, as though the network were learning, adapting, alive. It had become something beyond weaponry, beyond protocol. It had become memory with agency. Back at the convoy, the soldiers were beginning to feel it too. that strange connection humming beneath their skin, the awareness that the Ghost Network was no longer just transmitting through machines but through people. When one spoke, others seemed to know what to do before the words formed. Orders flowed without sound, synchronizing motion across distance. It was not telepathy, not magic, only a perfect discipline, shared by those who had once sworn the same oath and refused to forget it. Major Wren, still recovering but alert, sat propped inside the med transport, his voice gravelly over the internal comm. "You feel it, don't you?" he said. "It's the same thing we built in the field. The connection that Command tried to break." Vail nodded slightly. "They thought unity was a weakness, but unity is the only thing they couldn't corrupt." Ho Ken, the man in black, glanced at her, his tone half admiring, half accusatory. "You realize what you've created, don't you? This isn't just a network. It's a consciousness made of loyalty. That kind of thing doesn't go back to sleep." Vail looked at him, her expression calm but impenetrable. "Good," she said. "It was never meant to." Lightning flashed again across the horizon, not from the sky but from the ground, the spark of intercept drones racing toward their position. The convoy scattered, engines roaring, sand and debris rising in plumes behind them. "Incoming Directorate units," shouted the lookout. "High-altitude drones, 30 seconds out. Deploy shields and keep moving," Vail barked. The air filled with the electric hiss of defense grids powering on, the convoy weaving through the narrow pass as energy bolts rained down like silver rain. One transport exploded, flipping sideways in a burst of fire. Soldiers scrambled, pulling survivors from the wreckage. Through the chaos, Vail's voice cut clear and sharp through the comms. "Ghost units, coordinate by signal rhythm, not sight. The network has your vector." Her words carried farther than they should have, transmitted through channels both digital and human. Within seconds, the defense drones reoriented, forming a tight perimeter that intercepted the next wave of fire with surgical precision. The man in black gritted his teeth, gripping the rail beside her. "They'll keep sending them. You can't fight a whole world of systems." Vail's reply was quiet but absolute. "I'm not fighting the systems. I'm teaching them what loyalty sounds like." The battle burned across the plain for nearly an hour before the sky cleared again. The Directorate's drones falling silent one by one, their control signals overridden by the network's expanding code. When the last of them dropped from the clouds, the desert fell still once more, the only sound the hiss of cooling metal and the heartbeat rhythm of the Ghost Network still pulsing through every device. Vail stood amid the wreckage, rain and dust streaking her face, her soldiers regrouping around her in exhausted silence. The man in black stared at the fallen drones, each one flickering with the same symbol, a silver winged torch, the emblem of Requiem. "You've turned their weapons into your message," he said. Vail nodded slowly, her voice softer now, almost reflective. "Messages outlive wars. That's why they fear them." She looked toward the horizon again, where the faint light of dawn was breaking for the second time that week, pale and fragile yet stubbornly persistent. The Ghost Network had spread beyond containment, its signal now embedded in the very structure of the world. Governments would deny it, rewrite it, bury it again, but it would not matter. For every file they erased, 10 more would whisper in return. The soldiers stood at attention, waiting for her word. She raised her head, her voice carrying through the quiet with the weight of command reborn. "They'll come again," she said. "They'll come with everything they have. But from now on, every base, every satellite, every soldier who still remembers what duty means, they'll hear our signal." She turned back toward the convoy, the wind rising behind her, the air charged with the faint hum of destiny remembered. "Requiem isn't an organization anymore," she said. "It's a frequency, and as long as there's one voice left to answer it, it will never fade." And far above, beyond the clouds and the reach of any nation, satellites long forgotten began to blink in unison, their orbits aligning into the shape of the torch, a constellation reborn, bright enough for anyone who dared to look up and remember. By the end of the third week, the world had begun to fracture under the pressure of its own hidden truths. The Ghost Network's awakening had not merely disrupted the Directorate's power, it had exposed the silent architecture of every alliance, every covert treaty, every buried weapon the nations of the modern age had pretended did not exist. Data poured across encrypted lines like blood through reopened wounds, and for the first time in decades, Entire governments trembled at the sound of their own secrets being spoken aloud. Commander Vail watched the chaos unfold from the command platform aboard a decommissioned transport ship drifting through the Atlantic fog, its hull patched with steel salvaged from forgotten wars. The bridge hummed with a constant rhythm of signals, some friendly, others probing, all alive with the pulse of a world remembering what it had tried to forget. On the screen before her, maps of the globe shifted in endless motion, colored lines intersecting like veins carrying the lifeblood of rebellion. The man in black stood behind her, his voice steady but heavy with implication. You've turned information into insurgency. The network isn't just remembering, it's reacting. Cities are locking down, armies are mobilizing, entire economies are freezing under the threat of exposure. Vail didn't turn, her eyes stayed on the screen, where 100 red nodes pulsed in the shape of constellations. Then let them react, she said. Reaction means they're alive again. Complacency was killing them faster than any war could. Rain hammered the ship's exterior, a relentless percussion that merged with the low hum of the engines. The Atlantic stretched in all directions, a restless mirror reflecting the fractured light of satellites passing overhead. The crew worked silently, their movements precise, synchronized through the rhythm of the ghost network that now linked every mind on board. There was no need for orders. Intention moved faster than speech. New transmission coming in, one of the technicians said, her fingers gliding across the holographic console. Encrypted signature matches Directorate Origin Level 0 clearance. The man in black stepped forward. That's impossible. Level 0 died with the original council. The technician shook her head. It's not a directive, it's a message. The room fell silent. The transmission opened not with words, but with a symbol the same winged torch of the Requiem division, rendered in perfect clarity against a background of static. Then a voice, cold and unfamiliar, filled the air. Commander Vail, it said. This is Director Halden of the Global Security Directorate. I assume you understand the gravity of what you've unleashed. Vail's posture didn't change, but her jaw tightened. I understand perfectly, she said. I spent a lifetime cleaning up the consequences of men who claim to understand gravity. The voice continued, calm and calculated. You've destabilized international defense systems, exposed operations designed to maintain equilibrium. You've turned order into chaos in the name of ghosts. Whatever you think Requiem stood for, this isn't it. You've become the very thing you fought. Vail's eyes narrowed, the faint reflection of the screen glinting like ice. Order built on silence isn't order. It's rot disguised as discipline. You erased people and called it balance. You buried wars and called it peace. Halden's tone hardened. You're forcing us to respond. The world can't function under this kind of exposure. It shouldn't function at all, she replied. Not like this. The line crackled, and then his voice softened not with empathy, but with precision. If you continue, we'll activate the contingency buried in your system. You know what I'm talking about. You wrote the framework yourself before we purged it. For the first time, silence took her. The man in black looked at her sharply. What contingency? She exhaled slowly. The Ghost Protocol. A final safeguard written into the network's DNA, an autonomous purge system that activates if command control is breached. Halden's voice cut through again, clinical and merciless. Exactly. It's already running. In 12 hours, the network will begin deleting itself, one node at a time, and when it's gone, so will every trace of you. The transmission ended, the console dimmed to black. The rain seemed to grow heavier, pressing against the ship's hull like the weight of inevitability. The man in black turned to her, his voice sharp with urgency. Can you stop it? Vail's hands were steady on the console. No, she said. I can't stop it, but I can rewrite it. End quote. She moved quickly, her fingers dancing across the terminal, overriding safety locks and forcing the system to reveal its core code. Streams of encrypted data poured across the screen, scrolling so fast it became a blur of light. The crew gathered behind her, silent witnesses to the rebirth of a battle none of them fully understood. Every purge system has a kernel, she said. Something small enough to survive destruction, to rebuild from ashes. If I can find it, I can redirect the command sequence before it reaches the core. The man in black leaned closer, his voice low. And if you fail? She didn't look up. Then Requiem dies again, this time for good. Hours pass like minutes. The storm outside raged, thunder rolling across the sea like artillery fire. Inside, the air grew thick with tension, every breath heavy with electricity. The screen flickered as she worked, bypassing one layer of defense after another, each more ruthless than the last. Sweat beaded on her temple, her movements methodical yet human in their precision. Finally, the code shifted. A new message appeared. Root access granted sequence redirection, available. She paused. Her reflection split across the surface of the terminal, half in shadow, half in light. There it is, she whispered. The heart of it. The man in black frowned. If you redirect it, where does the purge go? Her answer came quietly. Into me. Before he could protest, she initiated the sequence. Light flooded the bridge, cascading through every console, every line of circuitry. The Ghost Network's pulse grew deafening, filling the air with a sound like distant thunder layered over whispers of voices, long dead. "Commander," the technician shouted, "you're merging with the system. The feedback will contain it," she said. "Anchor it." And two. The ship groaned as the power surged, waves slamming against its sides. Through it all, Vail stood unmoving, eyes locked on the code unraveling before her. Images flickered across the screens, faces of soldiers, fragments of battles, every life and death that had once belonged to Requiem. The purge sequence coiled like a serpent around her command signal, hesitating, confused, before finally bending. The light faded, the room fell still. The only sound was the steady hum of the ship's engines. The console displayed a single line of text, "Purge contained, command transferred to human host." The man in black looked at her, his voice barely a whisper. "You did it. You absorbed the network." Vail's eyes lifted slowly, their reflection faintly luminescent. "No," she said. "It absorbed me." Outside, the rain had stopped. The sky above the Atlantic was clear again, filled with the silent light of satellites realigning to new orders. And somewhere in that vast web of machinery, a human pulse now echoed steady, relentless, alive. The Ghost Network lived on, no longer as a system but as a consciousness bound to its creator. The world would call it myth, would label it anomaly, would spend years trying to decode the signal that now whispered through every transmission line. Iron Widow online. Requiem endures. Commander Vail stood at the bridge window, the reflection of the ocean glimmering beneath her feet. "They wanted a system that obeyed," she said softly. "I built one that remembers." And as the ship turned toward the horizon, slicing through the calm sea under a sky newly awake, she whispered to no one and to everything at once. Once a soldier, always a protector. Once erased, forever written. For 3 days, the Atlantic remained unnaturally calm, its surface smooth as tempered glass, reflecting the fractured starlight above like a field of broken mirrors. The ship drifted slowly eastward, its engines throttled low, every vibration synchronized with the faint, rhythmic pulse now emanating from the command deck. Within that steady heartbeat of light and code, the Ghost Network existed no longer as an external system but as something intimate woven into flesh, nerve, and memory. Commander Vail moved through the corridors with a composure that was almost spectral, her presence carrying a gravity that pulled the silence around her into order. The crew spoke in hushed tones when she passed, as though addressing a myth that had quietly become real. Inside the bridge, the man in black stood before the panoramic viewport, his reflection fractured by the faint blue haze cast from the consoles. He had seen war, power, and madness. But what stood behind him now was something else entirely, an equilibrium between human and machine, between memory and code. Vail approached, the soft sound of her boots breaking the hum. Her eyes, once a cold steel gray, now shimmered faintly with traces of circuitry beneath the iris, each pulse synchronized to the rhythm of the network. "You haven't slept," he said quietly, though the words sounded futile the moment they left his mouth. "I don't need to," she replied. "The system does that for me now. It processes in cycles. I dream while awake." He turned toward her, studying her face. "You say that like it's a victory." "It isn't," she said. "It's continuity. The network lives because I do. The price is that it never lets me forget." Outside, the sea stirred. Long arcs of bio...